So please welcome Matt Kelley.
Hey, everybody. I'm going to start by apologizing for my voice and maybe the fogginess. I got a cold. It hit me yesterday, and I was up all night not being able to sleep because of it. So if I seem a little off, it's because of the cold and the Dayquil and the coffee. Combination of that is not good. That and I've got 4 kids at home that also keep me up all night. So where's my, oh, I have a clicker. There we go. So, it's incredible that I'm talking on the heels of what was just said. I wasn't here for the earlier part of the day, but I came in right as our mayor began talking to the kids at Fawcett. And then we heard about some of the amazing work that the Children's Museum is funding. And then Tanisha talks to us about why place matters and why it's important to let children lead. I'm going to talk to you now for a few minutes about a project I'm running and a bit about my background and why it's important to let kids lead and why it's important to understand what kids know and how we can use that knowledge to make really, really good decisions, smarter decisions about how to make our cities more livable for our kids. The Action Mapping Project is my project. I, like Hunter said, am a professor at UW Tacoma in the Urban Studies program. I teach community development. I teach cartography. I teach people how to make maps. I teach people how to analyze spatial data. My passion really, though, lies in community development, in issues of livability. I've been interested in those things for a long time, since the late 90s when someone who's in the audience here today introduced me to a small community development agency in Los Angeles. From there, I worked in Philadelphia and came to Tacoma about 10 years ago. One of the first things I did when I got to Tacoma was have a baby. After that, I began working closely with United Way, with their Youth United. I didn't have the baby, by the way. My partner had the baby. Yes. I began working with Youth United, which is a fantastic part of United Way, was at that point. And my reason for working with Youth United was I realized that one of the voices, one of the aspects of our community that wasn't necessarily always considered when we would make decisions about livability were the kids. We're always thinking about economic development. We're always thinking about transportation. We very rarely think concretely about how we make places more livable for kids. So I went and began gathering groups of kids, sat them down at United Way, in their conference room and projected maps of the city of Tacoma on a whiteboard and had those kids drawing on those maps assets. So put X's on the map where the assets are. This is a way you do asset-based community development. You identify assets in neighborhoods and then you leverage those things. That was great. It was interesting. It was a few dozen kids. It was very experimental at that time, 10 years ago. The School of the Arts is a high school on the UW Tacoma campus. I went from Youth United to working with the School of the Arts and having kids draw maps about their experiences with nature, the ways they connect with nature in downtown Tacoma. Because one of the things that kids in urban places don't have a lot of is nature. They don't ever have the opportunity to connect with nature because we often don't have nature in urban areas, at least in any significant way. And nature, we know from lots of research, is important for kids' emotional, social well-being. It's important for the health of the community. It's particularly important for kids as they're growing up that they're able to connect to nature. So I was interested, how do kids connect to nature in an urban place? Turns out in unexpected ways. Maybe sitting on the stairs in a concrete jungle looking out over the water. That's a connection to nature. You're not in nature, but you can see nature. Seeing an open skyline. So the sites downtown where kids felt connected to nature were not natural spaces. Those are unexpected encounters with nature is what I call them. From that project, I began working with students in Federal Way, middle school students, elementary school students drawing maps of neighborhoods. This was also an experimental project, happened about 8 years ago. And we learned things like the parking lot at the YMCA is a place that kids do not want to go nearby to. This was, again, about 10 years ago. And when we asked those kids why is the parking lot of the YMCA red? Why do you draw X's on this parking lot? They say, well, we heard that somebody got killed there one time. things that happen in our urban spaces, in our neighborhoods, they live on in the youth imaginary, in those stories that kids tell to each other. They remember, and it's hard to reclaim those spaces. And it's hard to know that that's what's happening. That's why kids are avoiding fantastic spaces, because they heard something happen there one time. Now, fast forward to today. For about 2 years, I've been running a project that is now called the Action Mapping Project. AMP, which is the acronym for Action Mapping Project, is a project that's very much about community mapping. AMP is also an educational project, and AMP is designed specifically to empower youth, to give those youth voices, those youth a voice in the planning and development process. And I'm going to talk about all of this over the next few minutes. So how does AMP empower youth? I think we'll go there first, because that's been a theme through the last couple of talks. We're giving, with the Action Mapping Project, we're giving youth the opportunity to lead. These pictures are all pictures from what are called sketch mapping workshops. At these workshops, I go in, my students go in, middle school students go in, high school students go into classrooms and ask other students about their experiences with, and perceptions of their neighborhoods. We ask them to produce data. We ask them to generate knowledge about their experiences. We're giving them a voice in the decisions that are made about their neighborhoods. We don't want to, as adults, make decisions for kids. We want to make decisions with kids. We want to be sure that their voice is a part of those decisions. So this project is very much about generating information that we can use, extracting that from kids' minds and understanding it, and then using that to inform our decisions. We do this via sketch mapping. You can see papers, you can see pens, you can see kids. What they're doing, what this girl here is doing, is drawing her experience on a piece of paper and then sharing that with us. We're generating thousands of these pieces of paper. We're currently working in Lincoln Catchment. I'll walk through some of the details, but we're working with about 3,200 kids right now. That's a lot of paper. What I want you to see here is that you don't have kids looking bored or unenthusiastic or disengaged. You have kids looking excited and proud to show their work. I didn't ask those kids to jump up in the back of their classroom and show off their maps. I didn't ask her to mug with her map. She just did it because she was proud of what she did. She was proud to be participating. Now, a little bit of context. Working with youth is not novel. It's being done all over the world. It's been done for 10s, 20s, hundreds of years. Of course, we work with kids. In the last 10 years, there's actually been a lot of work internationally put into the practice of working with kids. UNICEF offers resources that are specifically designed to encourage cities and local agencies to engage kids in the practice of urban planning, in the practice of community development. Through their Child-Friendly Cities and Communities initiative, they're suggesting to all of us that, and this is a quote, so I'm going to read it, every child and young person has the right to grow up in an environment where they feel safe and secure, where they have access to basic services and clean air and water, where they can play, learn, and grow, and where their voices are heard and matter. And that's key. We need to hear their voices. We make sure they matter. So we can't talk to one or two kids. We need to make sure that we hear all their voices. Some other examples of youth-led or youth-engaged urban planning practice in Dublin. This is one example. You could look it up. Kids are being given cameras. They're walking around cities taking pictures of their everyday life. This is called photo voice. It's a method. We can then, as researchers, as professionals, look at those pictures and tease out what's going on in those kids' lives. What are their experiences like? Okay, what are their perceptions of their neighborhoods? Through pictures. UC Berkeley's Center for Cities and Schools is designed specifically, it's a center at Berkeley to connect schools and municipal agencies to engage kids in the planning process. All right, so connecting kids with the mayor, connecting kids with the economic developers, okay? The Child and the City Foundation at the bottom here is a broadly focused international organization that, again, is acting to connect academics, researchers, people that are experimenting with methods with practitioners so that we can think more creatively and be more effective in the ways that we engage kids in practice. Now, The scope of AMP is a little bit different than some of those projects. I've got some of our outcomes up here on the slide, but before I get to those outcomes, I want to make clear that AMP is working with 85 to 90% of middle school and high school age youth in the city of Tacoma. We're working closely with the Tacoma Public Schools. I saw Josh Garcia in the back. I don't know if he is still here, but the school district has opened up their doors and allowed us to come in and begin working with their students. We're working currently in the Lincoln catchment area, and we have engaged with now 90% of kids in that catchment area. Our project, the AMP project, consists of, and I'm going to walk through all of this later in more detail, but our project consists of establishing community mapping centers, AMP centers, in every high school in the city. We're beginning with Lincoln, and establishing community mapping teams. And those teams consist of undergraduates and high school students. We have undergraduate community mapping mentors who are working with teams of high school students. This is a youth-led project. I'm up here, there's graduate students working with me, and those graduate students oversee undergraduate students who oversee high school students who work with middle school students. I'm 6 degrees of separation away from the work that's happening in classrooms. Of course, I go to classrooms. I love to be in classrooms. I love to talk to the kids. But this project isn't about adults engaging with kids. This is about kids talking to kids about their experience and then generating knowledge about those experiences to give back to us. Now, this work is happening in schools. Okay, so one of our outcomes is data collection. I'm going to talk a lot about that. Another of our outcomes is educational, STEAM education, science, technology, engineering, arts, math. This is happening at schools. We're not bringing middle school kids, high school kids to UW Tacoma. We're going to them. We're using their technologies. We're working with career and technical education to make sure that we have laptops and computers that can run the software that we use in practice at their schools. We're teaching kids how to use this software in our AMP centers, and then those kids have pathways to higher education. At UW Tacoma, in the Urban Studies program, we run a degree called GIS and Spatial Planning. This is what kids are doing in high schools. We have a graduate degree in Geospatial Technologies. These are the technologies kids are learning in high schools. There's a direct pathway from kids in high school to an undergraduate degree and a graduate degree. And that's open to kids who participate. Finally, we're forging partnerships. We have several stakeholders who have been very kind to work with a startup project like this. Metro Parks Tacoma is helping to fund some of this work. Tacoma Pierce Health Department, they're helping to buy our Sharpies. We own 4,000 Sharpies. 4,000, that's, do you know how many boxes of Sharpies that is? That's 1,000 sets of 4-color Sharpies, all right? And you know what happens when I go into a school with a set of 4-color Sharpies? I come out with 5% less. It's not just the kids that like those. Are there any teachers in the room? Sharpies are sweet, right? It's hard to walk out of a school with the same number of Sharpies you walk in with. But it's important work, and we've had good support from agencies like the Health Department, like Metro Parks, like Safe Streets Tacoma, like UW Tacoma. Now, the AMP centers that we are establishing are permanent, okay? The goal here is that we create a sustainable ecosystem, and that ecosystem is designed to generate information that's actionable. And I'll show you what that information looks like because it's awesome. It's also designed to provide educational opportunities in an ongoing, sustainable way to kids who participate. So we create an AMP center at Lincoln High School. That center exists next year. It exists the following year. It's staffed by students. It's staffed by an undergraduate. Our community mapping teams, they're youth-led, okay? These are middle school students. When we go into a school, we train middle school students to go to their classes and run the surveys that I'll walk you through. This is very much about creating a sustainable program that can continue to produce the data and results that we need in order to do the sorts of things that we've been talking about all day here. Again, kids are excited to do this. Drawing maps is not something they get to do often. Asking kids about their experience, we saw the mayor talk to 8 kids. Can you imagine going and talking to 600 kids in a week? Because we just did it at First Creek. We were in every single class. We talked to 600 kids at Stewart Middle School the week before that. We're talking to 1,600 kids next week at Lincoln High School. And every single kid has the opportunity to tell us the same sorts of stories that they just told the mayor. But the difference is we're keeping track of those stories. Now, that's kind of where the magic comes in. You know what? I didn't start my timer, so I'm okay. The problem, when you're excited about the work you do, you realize you can talk forever. And so kind of like Tanisha, I sort of have a script here. I have bullet points because I realized I would stand up here for 2 hours telling you stories. So I'm trying to stay to it, and I forgot to start my timer. So I'm going to walk you through the process, the data side, on the data side, because that's, I think it seems mysterious, but it's also very exciting, and the results are outstanding from both a research side of things as well as a practical side of things. I think just as community members, you'd be very excited to see kids' experience on maps. This is the result of 2 years of pilot work. I started working with a single student about 2 years ago with Safe Streets Tacoma in neighborhoods. We would go out to neighborhoods and ask people who lived in neighborhoods to draw on a map. Okay, draw for us where you spend time during the day. Draw for us lines on roads that you use. Okay, that was 6, maybe 10 people at a time in neighborhoods. We piloted this project at Stewart Middle School about 1.5 years, 2 years ago. Worked with 600 kids between Stewart Middle School and Lincoln High School. Ran the same sorts of surveys that had been tweaked slightly and generated some really fascinating results. From there, we've refined our methods, we've built out a process, and now we're rolling out in our first year in Lincoln catchment area what is hopefully a long-term project. So we begin with sketch mapping workshops. And I'm just going to walk through the process now. Those sketch mapping workshops you saw some pictures of. At these workshops, kids are asked to respond to prompts like, get out your blue pen, get out your map. On that map, draw outlines around the areas where you tend to spend time. Tend to spend time when you're not in school and you're not at home. Get out your red pen. On your map, draw red outlines around those areas where you tend to avoid for whatever reason, okay? And so on. And I'll show you some examples of this. We're also generating qualitative information, demographic information. We want to know not just where do kids spend time, but who are you? We're working with not 30 kids. We're working with 3,200 kids in the Lincoln catchment area. That means we can stratify our data. We can pinpoint African American students who are male, who are between the ages of 12 and 15. And we can tell you where they're spending time after school. We can tell you where everyone is spending time after school. We can tell you where Asian American girls are spending time after school. So we're generating that information as well as information about what do you do after school? How do you feel after school? That's important qualitative data. That's exactly what the mayor was just asking these kids up here. We need that qualitative information on top of the quantitative information. Now, we have to convert our paper to digital data in order to analyze it. That's a process that I think is kind of magical, that hopefully you will too. Maybe you'll think it's boring, but it's a necessary evil, and it's also a really core part of this project. So I'll explain that. And then we take all of those digital data and we model them. We create maps of aggregate experience in what's called a GIS, a Geographic Information System. This is a fancy piece of software that essentially makes maps. Okay, and I'll show you what the outcome of this process is. Now, from these aggregate data, we aim to surface or identify opportunities within our neighborhoods where small investments can reap huge rewards. All right, we don't have a lot of money to spend as a city on on improvements for youth in particular, but we have money to spend, right? The Kids Museum is doing this. If we can identify opportunities where $5,000 would make a huge difference, great. But where are those opportunities? Are we going to guess where they are as adults? We're going to ask 4 kids and hope that they represent the population, or, as we're doing here, we're trying to generate information so that we can make smart investments. Sketch maps. What we've got here on the screen is an example of a sketch map. Does it? Oh, good. Oh, I can walk. Okay, well, here's the part of the presentation where I'll probably just wander around for a little while. The blue areas on this map represent areas where this particular student has said that they spend time when they're not at school, when they're not at home, on weekends. Green X's represent assets, things that they think are important. Okay? Red outlines, those represent areas that kids avoid. The red lines, this grid pattern, that's a grid of streets that the kid avoids. And when we ask the question, and when I train middle school students to ask the question, I tell them, these aren't streets that you don't use, these are streets that you actively avoid. Okay? When you're out walking to your friend's house, which streets are you going to go out of your way to walk around? The maps that we generate in workshops are detailed. Activity spaces, the amount of space that's covered by the data that the kid draws, they may be large, they may be small. It really depends on how much room that kid occupies when they're not in school, when they're not at home. We know things from academic research that suggest that activity spaces in certain neighborhoods are larger than in other neighborhoods. These data can help us to understand that. Kids write on maps. They tell us stories on maps. And as we are what I'm going to call digitizing these maps, we keep track of all this information. Some kids are really positive about their neighborhoods. Some kids are not. But again, that's important to know, right? Because if you sit down with 6 kids, and all those kids happen to be really positive about their neighborhoods, you may not get the full picture, right? We're aiming to work with all kids. We made a commitment to the Tacoma Public Schools that if they let us into the schools, we'd work with at least 80% of kids in their schools. Right now, we're running about 90%. Kids are excited to participate. So what do? We take those, forgot. We don't take anything yet. These are the demographic data we collect. So as the kids are drawing on maps, we're also asking them to answer a few questions about themselves. Remember, I want to stratify these data. I don't want to know just where all kids are, but we want to be able to focus, to pinpoint where specific sets of kids are. So we ask a few demographic questions. We're also asking kids some questions about how they spend their time after school. What do you do after school? How do you feel after school? These data, they write in. Some kids write more, some kids write less. As we digitize these data are being collected, put into a spreadsheet, and they're connected to these maps. So we can then know kids who are this age range are tending to do these sorts of things. We can analyze these qualitative data. We're academics, that's what we do. We analyze data. But we can analyze those data and we can tease out themes, right? We want to know, what are some themes from Lincoln? Are the themes from Lincoln different than the themes from the stadium catchment, than the themes from the Foss catchment? Are kids experiencing space differently? I'm gonna jam here. All right, we digitize data. Those data that were drawn have to become digital, okay? They look like this, they become this. Okay. Once they're digital, we can analyze them. We can take those digital data, the shapes, and this is where our high school students come into play. Okay, this is how we get them involved in GIS. They're helping us to digitize data. It means that they have to learn how to do GIS. We take those digital data and we create maps of activity spaces. These maps represent activity spaces for about 600 youth in our pilot project. The dark blue areas up top, those are parts of the Lincoln catchment area where kids tend to spend a lot of time outside of school. Next to those are areas where kids tend to not spend a lot of time. Those are areas where kids tend to avoid. The blue grid, those are roads the kids use. The red grid, those are roads, streets, sidewalks, paths that kids tend to avoid. We can learn a lot from these data. These data are aggregate. They represent the spatial imaginary, the experience, the perception of the kids who participated. This was a pilot project. We'll have these same data to represent all 3,200 kids from the Lincoln catchment by the end of the summer. Now, we surface opportunities by producing these data. One way that we do that is that we take those maps you just saw, sit down with groups of kids and ask them to draw on the posters. Draw on this map of blue spaces, okay? These are called focus groups. We sit down with groups of kids and say, all right, so why is this blue? Why is that red? Tell us what's going on. We can't presume to know why something is blue, red, green. We need to hear from the kids why something is blue, red, or green. Because again, we're not living in their shoes. In talking to kids, one thing that comes up repeatedly in the Lincoln catchment area is that Lincoln Park, which is a great public green space on a walking route next to a high school, is not ideal for the kids. Okay, there's lots of reasons for that. I don't think it's a surprise to many of us who know the area, who know the park, that it would be a part of the district that the kids don't particularly want to spend time in, but that they tend to spend time in because it's where they spend time. It's an opportunity. Small investments can make big improvements to the livability of their neighborhood for these kids. First Creek Middle School. What's going on at First Creek Middle School? Hey, Eastside Community Center. All right, so ironically, and I think this is fantastic, in our data we've found that the field that had been next to First Creek Middle School was not particularly appealing to the kids at First Creek Middle School. Again, it's a public kind of green space, unimproved. It's on a walking route. It's also right across the street from a donut shop that the kids love. That's where they hang after school, hit up the donut shop, but there had been a space across the street that they did not like. As a community, I think through anecdotal evidence, we realized that this is an opportunity. So the Eastside Community Center is going in, right there, right? What our data can do is tell us that pre-Eastside Community Center, this was a red area. This was a no-go zone. 2-3 years from now, when we're producing these data, which are longitudinal, every year we produce a new set of data for the Lincoln catchment area. 2-3 years from now, that red should turn to blue, right? Because there's now an asset. There's now a community asset in that area that should be drawing kids, that should have been transformative. If that's not blue 2-3 years from now, we should ask ourselves some hard questions. Why? Why is it that that has not gone from red to blue? To build this project is complicated. I'm running out of time, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time here talking about how we do this, but suffice to say, it's a tremendous amount of coordination among agencies, among students. We train high school students, we train middle school students. We are working with thousands of students. We're analyzing data, we're running focus groups. Now, I want to talk about the future and then give you a short anecdote before I close. We're rolling out this project over 3 years in the Tacoma Public School system. By the end of year 3, we'll have 5 action mapping centers, 1 in every high school. We're working with every kid, every year, in an ongoing, sustainable way, supposing that we have the resources to do so. We're running summer mapping camps with kids in partnership with career and technical education to teach these kids to do GIS outside of school hours. And we're producing those longitudinal data that can inform the ways that we do community development. We have supporters, we absolutely need more. Now, I want to end with an anecdote. I've spent countless hours with kids over the last few years. Just recently, I was in a middle school classroom, and I'm sitting there, and I like to sit with one kid and just ask questions. And he had drawn on his map an X and a little green box around the X. The green boxes represent their neighborhoods. This kid had drawn a very small green box, which meant that his neighborhood, in his eyes, was quite small. Okay? He drew a little green line between his green X and his school. In between his house and his school was a grid of red. He had to run the gauntlet to get to school. There was no way around it. He told me he does not like that, but he has to go there. Now, when I asked him the question, and the survey asked him the question, how do you feel after school? He says, hungry, right? Hungry. So we have a responsibility, okay? We have a responsibility to do everything in our power to ensure that kids aren't walking home scared and hungry, right? One way to do this is that we act on the knowledge that we have about everyday kids' lives. Another way to do this is to empower kids to be the change that they want to see in their neighborhoods. It's challenging. With the Action Mapping Project, we're teaching them, we're listening to them, and we're providing them opportunities to be those leaders. This kid has the opportunity to grow up and make the change in his neighborhood that he wants to see. We can't do this without supports. Right now, I'm working on the backs of volunteer undergraduates, graduates, high school students. If you want to be involved in the project, I'd love to hear from you. We have stakeholders, we need more. It's a great project. It's doing the things that we need to do to make our cities better for kids. Okay. Thanks for having me today. I think I'm out of time.
Great. Thank you.